Genesis chapter 1, starting at verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kind, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and every living creature that moves on the ground." And then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of this whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. God bless the reading of his word.
Please do turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. We continue in our series, Paradise to Prison, and today we want to consider the pinnacle of creation, God's creation of human beings. What does God think about something like murder, or something positive like marriage, human worth and value, your identity, male and females being equal, how humans should treat the environment? These are all big questions in our day and have been hot-button issues in the larger society from time to time, and all of them have significant implications for each of us. But are you aware that every single one of these issues, and many others besides, are touched on by God in the first chapter of Genesis, specifically those verses we just read? That is, God begins to tell us his pattern for human behavior, starting in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible. If you want to know what God thinks about marriage, of murder, of the penalty for murder, of human worth and value, all of it's going to go back to Genesis. And we're going to begin to see how some of that plays out today, and we'll continue into next week as well, Lord willing. But we begin with day 6, where God begins to create the land animals, and then he culminates all of it in the pinnacle of creation, the creation of human beings in his image. Let's pick it up in verse 24. And God says, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." We see that term again. "Livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. The word used here, the first one, living creatures, is a generic term. It just covers all the land animals. But then you notice he breaks it down into 3 categories: livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth, which encompass pretty much all the land animals. Remember, on day 3, God both created the land and then he filled it with plants. Those wonderful self-reproducing solar-powered generators that we call plants. But remember that the plants were never called living creatures. From a biblical frame of reference, they're not living, not in the same way that an animal is living. And the Bible makes that clear. But on day 5, God then begins to build, if you will, or produce or create all the land animals, or I should say on day 5, the sea and air animals, followed by the land animals on day 6. Furthermore, on day 6, something interesting is told to us. God didn't create the animals out of nothing, as he did other things. He actually creates them out of the ground. So he takes some pre-existing material and forms it obviously intricately and with a lot of intelligence and design behind it, he forms it into these animals. And that is appropriate for what we're going to find out later in verse 28, because mankind, the first man, Adam, is given dominion over all the animals on the earth. And so mankind has this rulership, dominion over the earth and over the animals on the earth that God is going to entrust to him. And so it makes sense in one way of looking at it that God creates these animals from the earth, and when they die, they decompose and go back into the earth. The first group God made is what we might call cattle, livestock. Think sheep, goats, and also cows and that sort of thing. The second is the creeping things. And that's a broad term, which means animals that glide or slink. So it's talking about their form of locomotion. We might think of some reptiles, for instance. And then he has a third category. But before we consider the third category, just remember our taxonomy, our way of looking at the animal kingdom and the whole world, the way we structure it and the names we give it, all of that is relatively recent in human history, as we considered last week. And so what that means is the Bible categorizes these animals in a different frame of reference. Specifically in chapter 1, oftentimes the way God seems to categorize these animals or these creatures, whether they're creatures in the sky, in the sea, or on the land, it's not first and foremost by, whether they have this gland or that fur or this many feet. Rather, it's either by their form of movement, or more specifically, it's how they relate to human beings. And so that's how we see him delineating these three types of animals. The first one, the livestock, the cattle, they relate to human beings in one way, because human beings can domesticate them, you might say. Cows, sheep, goats. The next category, slinking things, that's a different category. Those are the sort of animals that mankind usually doesn't domesticate. You're not going to take them home as your pet. And the third category that he gives us, remember, each kind of animal produces after its kind. He refers to this group as the beasts of the earth. And that phrase appears about 24 times in the Old Testament. And outside of Genesis, after the fall, it's always referring to animals that eat the flesh of other animals. So it's those animals that later on become carnivores, it seems. And these are the type of animals, at least some of them, that mankind might hunt for food. So you see how each type of animal has a slightly different relationship to human beings, which God has not created yet. But since God is going to give human beings dominion and rulership over the earth, it's important for us to understand which groups of animals, so to speak, relate to human beings in which way. And so these three categories are sort of catch-all categories when combined. And so that means that every creature, even the creatures that, from our perspective today, are extinct, whether those are large animals such as certain types of deer or the giant sloth or different types of bears and other creatures that have now gone extinct, or even the dinosaurs, many of which, of course, have gone extinct, all of these were created, all these land animals were created together on day 6. Of course, they go extinct later on in human history for different reasons. Sometimes Christians are a little tripped up that the word dinosaur isn't mentioned in the Bible. And I often get that question. It's a good question, but we should remember the word itself, dinosaur, and in the English language, did not originate until 1842. So it's a very recent word, only in the last 200 years. So we wouldn't expect the Bible to have that word, and even most English translations are based on translations from before 1842. But there are words in the Bible that seem to refer to large animals like dinosaur-like creatures. For instance, if you were to look at Job 40, and you can do this week, read Job chapter 40, and you'll read of this animal called behemoth. And behemoth is the plural form of the word used here in Genesis 1 for beasts of the earth. And it's used in the plural there, not because it's talking about more than one animal. God only shows one animal to Job in Job 40, but the plural form emphasizes the animal, and the description expresses that this is one of the biggest animals in that category. And if you read through the description, it sounds very much like some sort of dinosaur or creature that we no longer have because it's gone extinct. And so those creatures are part of this beasts of the earth category, and the Bible does speak about them. That's not the only passage that speaks of a large animal named behemoth. But let us also make a New Testament connection here. We've tried to emphasize throughout that the New Testament authors and Jesus himself are often referring back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 when they're arguing or explaining Christian doctrine to followers of Christ. And that's what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15. It's often noted as a sort of passage primarily on the resurrection. The argument that he's giving there is that Jesus, when he died, 3 days later, he rose bodily from the dead, and he continues to intercede for us. He went back to heaven. And one day when we die, if we know Christ, we too will be raised to new bodily life. What is one of the basis points or the foundations upon which he builds that entire argument about the resurrection of Jesus being the foundation for our future resurrection if we follow Christ? It's this. He refers to days 5 and 6 of the creation in reverse order, and he says, not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, one kind for animals, one kind for birds, and another for fish. That is, part of Paul's entire argument in that whole passage is predicated on how God created human beings exactly, historically, like it states in Genesis chapter 1. And if that's not true, then the basis for part of Paul's argument, both for the resurrection of Jesus, which actually happened in history, and for our future resurrection, which will one day happen in history, it all falls apart. And we see once again that if those things, I should add to that, if those things fall apart, then there's no atonement for sin that Jesus accomplished on the cross. You have no forgiveness, you have no redemption, you have no salvation. And so all these things are interrelated, and we see once again how the Bible connects to itself and the future truths of Christianity from the perspective of the Old Testament believers. Those future truths, the ones that we hold so dear, are predicated on these historical realities going all the way back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And from that flows another helpful application or a helpful thought. If God's original creation, as we've seen up to this point, was so beautiful, so glorious, so intricate, you had the different kinds of animals producing after their kind. We've seen some of the detail and the information, and we could go all the way down to the genome and the DNA, all that God created. It's so glorious. And yet, what you and I experience when we walk outside, we experience an amazing world with beautiful, vibrant colors and all sorts of creativity, but of course it's been marred by sin. Some things don't work the way they should. There are mutations. There's thorns and thistles, which were a result of sin. There are animals eating each other, and as some evolutionists like to say, and I think Jack London made it popular, nature is red in tooth and claw. The man-eat-man world that we live in. And yet, despite all of that sin, despite all of the bad, there is still great beauty out there. But here's the glorious truth for a Christian. If the world that we still possess, marred by sin as it is still having so many elements of beauty and creativity and things we can appreciate and be amazed at, how much better is the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth that God says he will one day make? How much greater is that going to be? We haven't seen anything like what God is going to make, where he, in essence, remakes it back to what it was intended to be, where everything works properly. All those animals that we have since killed off in some way, shape, or form, or have died off and have gone extinct, all the ecosystems that are all messed up right now, all of that is going to be reverted back to what it was before human sin and before all the resulting judgment on this earth. And that's a glorious thought, something to look forward to. That we will get to experience that if we are followers of Christ. But now we move on to consider the pinnacle of God's creation, man. Mankind, created in his image. Look at verses 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion or rulership over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." That is, to have dominion over everything else God had made on this planet. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, in those few brief words, we find a lot of information. And if we tease out the implications of all that God is saying, we find it helps us a great deal to answer all those questions we started with and many others besides. We're told in Genesis chapter 2, when God formed Adam, the first man, the word formed there, which is what it's talking about in chapter 1 as well, it's the Hebrew word yatsar, which means God spent special time, detailed time, creating Adam. Of course, we've already seen God can create out of nothing. He can say a single word, and it's there. But here, he takes his time, not because he needs the time, but to show the special nature of what he's making. This word is used throughout the Old Testament in other ways as well. For instance, the skill of a potter fashioning a pot. That's what we're talking about, a skillful employment by God to create humankind. And this means, among other things, that man is different than the animals. It also means, because God just finished creating the animals, now he's creating man, that animals and man are different. They are different categories. Man does not evolve from animals. They are fundamentally different. Now, this is despite the fact, of course, that many Darwinists want to say that we descended from ape-like creatures who themselves descended from simple organisms that climbed out of the primordial slime or soup. But the question is your great-great-grandfather an ape? No. Is your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather a primordial soup? No. That's what God says. These two views are mutually exclusive. Some Darwinian scientists suggest, furthermore, that humans are simply, and all living things, are simply the sum total of their chemical parts. Maybe some of you have seen this if you've taken an anatomy class. There are some who have broken down the human body, water molecules, and we're this much water, and we're this much iron, and we're this much, and they break it all down, and then they do a cost analysis. How much do all the component parts of your body, how much would that cost? And they come out to something ranging between like $10 to $25. Now, that sort of reductionist, materialistic idea that you are only worth the sum total of your parts, that makes sense in Darwinian evolution. It doesn't make any sense in Christianity. Why? Because what makes us fundamentally human is not the tiny individual component parts, the molecules that make us up. What makes us human, what makes human beings worth so much, or being the pinnacle of God's creation, is what? Because God gave us life, a soul, and an ability to have a relationship with him. So man's body, yes, it came from the ground, that's true, and certainly we are made up of all sorts of different elements, but the life that Adam possessed came from God. We see this, sadly, we have to see this in a broken world, when we see someone we love who's in hospital and they pass away, and yet because of modern technology, we can actually keep their heart pumping for a time and keep their lungs inflating for a time with artificial machinery, and yet there's no brain waves, there's no brain activity. They've actually died, but the physical substance of their body is still moving, but there's no life. You see, there's something intangible about human beings, which is the substance of our true existence, our true life. And that's why God, among other reasons, he forms mankind. He gives them special time and consideration as he forms it, this first man, and then he breathes into him the breath of life. God created man. He determined to create man. And notice he creates, between Genesis 1 and 2, we get the full picture, he creates one man and one woman. Now, how many of the other animals did he create? Well, it says he filled the air and the sea and the land with these other animals. So he clearly seems to have made thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, or even millions of pairs of animals and fish and birds. How many does he make of human beings? 2. One pair. That's it. The precise language used here when God is forming Adam is important. The Holy Spirit specifically chose this word, and it describes that hands-on approach that God gave to humanity. He doesn't do that with anything else in all of his creation. That should give us a hint already. Something special is happening here. Here God sets man apart from plant life, from conscious life of fish, birds, animals, and it's by a specific and definite act of God that he creates man to be a living thing with conscious life, and he tells us he does that and he creates man in his image and his likeness. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, we're told, once again, verses 26 and 27, let us make man in our image. Why the plural? Us, our. And he says, in the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Well, you see, man is created directly from God, and he's the only thing in creation that has God's image. We'll discover what that image is. But notice first how God refers to himself. Let us create man in our image. What's the us and the our? Well, it's the divine deliberation between the Father, Son, and Spirit, the three persons of the Trinity, as they interact with one another. This had always been the determined counsel of God to create this world, to create humanity, a being that could have a relationship with his Creator. And here we see them working together in perfect unity, Father, Son, and Spirit, to create this new being. And in fact, the first lesson that Adam is taught, according to the Bible, in verse 26, later on, chapter 2, verses 18 to 24, is that he is fundamentally different from everything else God had made. What makes the difference? What makes the difference is that he was created in God's image and in his likeness. And at first glance, that phrasing sounds really strange because God, the God of the Bible, the way he is described, he's a spirit. He doesn't have a human body by nature. He's not limited to a human form. And so when we hear mankind is created in God's image and likeness, if we didn't know better, we might think, well, that means that God must just be a slightly bigger, stronger, better form of a human being. And that, in fact, is what many people have believed throughout history. If you look at Norse mythology, you look at Greek mythology, you look at Roman mythology, you look at Celtic mythology, all the gods and goddesses are just slightly bigger, better, stronger human beings, but with all the same issues as human beings. And out of that, they create some way, shape, or form human beings. That's not what it's talking about, because that's not the God we're talking about. What it means is that we, among other things, is that we have some similarity with God. We are created to have a relationship with God, and he created us to have certain characteristics that he has. We don't have those characteristics to the same extent that he has them, but we do have some of them to a limited extent. These are what in Christian doctrine is called the communicable attributes of God. His reason, his love, his will, his discernment, his morality, his ability with language. We as humans have all those things, obviously in a limited capacity. But there's a whole nother set of his attributes called the incommunicable attributes. That means it can't be shared with creatures, which are things like the fact that he is all-powerful. He is all-knowing. He can be everywhere at once because he is a spirit and he's not bound by space, time, and matter. He created it. He's self-existing. You and I aren't self-existing. We come into existence at some point in history, and our physical bodies at least will die, even though our souls live on. But he has always been existing. So there are certain attributes of God that he allows us to share in a limited fashion, so that we can be creatures who can have a relationship with him and be his rulers and have dominion over this world. Man, created in God's image, means man is the only creation built to have that relationship with his Creator. Man is meant to commune with, praise, obey, and worship his Creator. This is why Francis Schaeffer, he said this in his book, Genesis in Space and Time. He says, Genesis is not so much a history of man, that is, it's not just about anthropology, but it's a history of the redemption of man. That is, it's a history of how God desired and designed to have a relationship with us and how he made that possible, how we messed it up, but how he chose to overcome our rebellion so that we could once again have that relationship with him. It results in man being the only one that God has given dominion over creation. It means that man also has inherent value and dignity. You're valuable as a human being individually because God created you with value and dignity. You're not valuable because society says you're valuable, not because your culture says or your family says or your romantic attachment gives you fulfillment enough to make yourself feel valuable. Yet so many of us, we find our identity and our worth in those passing things. But what happens when the relationship breaks down? What happens when we move countries and immigrate somewhere else and we're no longer surrounded by people who think and act just like us? What happens when our family passes away? We can feel untethered, unmoored, and we don't know who we are anymore. We lose that job that we've had for 20 years. Who am I? Why? Because we're trying to find our identity, our worth, our value in something that is fleeting, that's passing. In the Roman world, when a general would win a victory, some of you might be familiar with this, they would often ride into Rome, the capital city, after their great victory at the head of their army in a chariot, all decked out in gold and splendor. And someone, a slave usually, would be behind them holding a golden crown of sorts, holding it over their heads, not placing it on their head, but holding it over their heads as they ride through the streets. And everyone's this triumphal entry and people are celebrating, but that slave would be whispering in the general's ear, "This too will pass. This too will pass." That is, you're temporary. You're going to die, and all this glory is going to be gone very soon. What an interesting thing to say. Why? Because that general might start getting a little too big for his britches, so to speak. He might start getting a big head. Look at how amazing I am. Yeah, but pretty soon you're going to be gone. There will be another general who comes. There's a different Caesar who's on the throne. Well, that's a good reminder, a humbling reminder that the Romans used, but how much more should we understand both our value, dignity, and worth, but also our sense of humility and proportion that we should have because we are created in the image of God. But being created in God's image is also important for other reasons as well. It tells us something about morality. For instance, in Genesis 9:6, God forbids murder. And he tells human beings, do not murder. And he ordains the death penalty for anyone who commits murder. This is why he does that. He says, "For God made man in his own image." So the reasoning God institutes the death penalty for murder, full stop, is because mankind is created in God's image. Later on in the New Testament, we're told by James in the book of James, chapter 3, verse 9, he warns us about the danger of the tongue and our words precisely because he says, with our tongues we bless God and we also curse our fellow human being who's made in the image of God. Now, what are both of these passages pointing to? What it points to is this. Human beings naturally tend to have a low opinion of the value of human beings. To say it differently, you and I, our natural sinful inclination is to have a low value, a low opinion of other human beings. We usually have an inflated view of ourselves and a devaluing view of other people, which is why we don't think much of it when we gossip and slander about other people. We don't think much of it when we troll people online. We don't think much when we say something nasty online that we would never say in person. It's why in our society, because our society as a whole has such a low view of human value, it's why no matter how many murders a person commits in this country, we will not enact the death penalty in almost any instance. Why? Because we don't really care about the image of God in them. We don't care about those victims the way we should. We don't realize that an attack, any attack on another human being, is an attack on God, their creator. That's what God says. We don't realize that our harmful words against another human being is a direct attack on God because we are attacking the image of God in that human being. Do you see how God's way, the proper way of viewing the world, changes everything? It will change everything about the way we view the world and morality. Man is created in God's image, and that means that we as individuals, we don't have the right to take human life whenever we want to. Whether we call it abortion, euthanasia, or murder, they're all direct attacks on the image of God in man. We cannot escape it. These truths are what God tells us. And he tells us in the first chapter of his book that he gave to us to teach us how we should act. But there are other moral categories. Let's consider this one. What does this tell us? God creating human beings in his image, male and female, both in his image. What does that tell us about the worth and the value and dignity of both sexes? Well, first of all, it tells us there are only two sexes, male and female. That's unfortunately up for grabs these days. But it also tells us something about the worth and dignity of women and girls. Both sexes are given the exact same command to subdue and rule the earth. This passage is the foundation for why and how men and women should be treated with equal value. And it also explains the high view of women within Christianity historically, and it also explains the low view of women in other cultures and other religions. Rodney Stark, a well-known historian of antiquity, upon writing about the Roman Empire and the beginning of the church age, the first few hundred years after Jesus, and his death and resurrection, he estimates, based on the texts and the archaeological evidence we have, he estimates that 2/3 of the early church was made up of women. And this is fascinating because he goes on to suggest, he says, actually, if you read the documents of the ancient Roman world, it's a wonder that every single woman and girl did not become a Christian overnight. Now, that seems like a weird thing to say. Why did he say that? He said because it's only in the church, it was only in Christianity that women were considered equal. In Roman society, they were not. They never were. They were always second-class citizens. It's only in Christianity, in that ancient world, that men and women, boys and girls, slaves and free men, were all considered equal before God, because that's what God's word says. The Christian view of women is based on Old Testament passages like this. This is the first of them, Genesis 1 and 2, and Proverbs 31 is another great example, and there are many others. But in many cultures in which this Judeo-Christian worldview is suppressed, what do we see? We see women as second-class citizens. In many places, we even see something like baby girls purposely being killed before or after birth because they are considered of lesser value. Despite the pro-women statements in the Bible and the obvious framework from which it comes, if you study it, there's this odd dynamic today where many people have this view that the Bible is anti-women or it views women as second class. And sadly, many have bought into that because they've never read the Bible. But it must be clearly understood that there's actually no other worldview, no other philosophy, no other religion, and I am not using hyperbole here. There is no other one, period, that says from the very beginning and upholds it all the way through that men and women are created equal and have equal value and dignity before God because of how God created them intrinsically. Only Christianity says that. In fact, Christianity is the only basis for all the positive elements of what we consider to be modern human rights. But most people are unfamiliar with this now because they're unfamiliar with Genesis and the rest of the Bible. Furthermore, and this is the true travesty, it's the Darwinian worldview that provides no basis whatsoever for the right treatment of women. For instance, well, here's where it comes from. If you read Darwinian philosophy and theology, what you will find is that they say male and female both evolved independently. And so if you evolve independently, it's unlikely that both sexes are going to result in beings of equal value and worth. So that's the first point. But secondly, what can right treatment of women mean in a world where all that ultimately matters is the propagation of genes and the passing on of your DNA, survival of the fittest? That's the goal of Darwinian evolution. So where does value and intrinsic worth come from for male or female in such a world? And please hear this clearly. Based on this worldview of Darwinism, which I remind us is a God-denying worldview, is it any wonder that Darwin and his fellow writers in his day explicitly argued that women were inferior to men? This is one of Darwinism's dirty little secrets that no one will tell you. But if you read their writings, it's clear. They say it word for word. Women are inferior to men. That is the natural order. More recently, two evolutionists, and these are just representative, but they were a little more courageous than others to actually put it in a written book that became a significant seller. Two evolutionists following this Darwinian paradigm and following the thinking to its logical conclusions, here's what they said. They claimed that rape is merely a means for men to propagate their genes, which is a good thing in Darwinian evolutionary thought. One of these men, when pressed in a Q&A, he would not and could not say that something like rape is wrong, because from a Darwinian framework, you cannot say it is wrong. Now, I hope you are appalled at such a thought. But what is that individual doing? They are being consistent with their worldview. Ideas have consequences. We've seen that throughout this series. And now, having said all that, it's more than enough of an appropriate time to ask this question. Why on earth are so many Christians in our society and the Western world as a whole trying to take Darwinian ideas and shove them into the Bible? That is the majority opinion in our day and age. To try to take this Darwinism and fit as much of it as possible into the Bible. They are two contradictory worldviews. They are two completely different views of human beings, human value, human worth. You cannot put them together. But here's on the positive side, only in Christianity do women and girls, men and boys as well, have intrinsic value, inherent worth, inalienable dignity. Why? Because God made them all equally in his image. That's what you see Jesus acting in light of when he was here on earth. Look at how Jesus treated others, how he treated men and women, older, younger, children, both sexes. How did he treat them? He treated them with dignity, with value. He was even significantly misunderstood at multiple points because of how he treated women appropriately. Why? Because he was doing what he told us to do, because we are created in his image, and he knew that we had equal value and dignity, and so he acts like it, and we should do the same. Any follower of Christ must do the same. And on this note, each of us would probably be greatly helped and encouraged and instructed if we were to read a great sermon. Normally, I don't suggest you read a sermon. That seems a little weird, but there's a great sermon called The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis. It's written both as a sermon and an essay, and you can find it easily. In part of that sermon, here's what he says about the image of God in man. I'll switch around a few words to kind of bring it up to speed because he wrote this 70 years ago. He says, there are no ordinary people. He's talking about Genesis 1, creation of God, creation of man in God's image. He says, there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere human being. When we have a conversation, we think, oh, just talk to another human being. He said, no, you've never talked to someone who's only another human being. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, those things are temporary. Those things are passed away. Their life is very short-lived. But every time you talk to a human being, you're talking to an immortal. You are talking to someone, you are joking with someone, you're marrying someone, you're snubbing someone, you're exploiting someone who has an eternal soul and will go to live in one of two places. That is, you've never met a mere human being because every single one of us is unique and created in God's image. And he's exactly right. That's what God is saying. Let's wrap this up this way. In the ancient world, an image represented something, and we see that in the New Testament. So there's a clear example of this in Matthew 22. When the Pharisees, the Herodians, they come to Jesus, they want to trick him. Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Do you remember what Jesus responded? He said, show me a coin whose image and likeness, exact same words, whose image and likeness is on the coin, Caesar's. Then he says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. What is he saying? Pay your taxes because that coin, it has his image or likeness. That means in some way, shape, or form, it ultimately belongs to him in a way. And so just give him back what's his. He owns it. But then he doesn't stop there. He says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. What has God's image and likeness on it? You and me, every human being. And he says, give back to God what belongs to him. What belongs to him? You and me. Everything about us belongs to him. That's why Jesus says in another passage, love God, and it's repeated in the Old Testament as well. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Why? Because all of it belongs to God. Because we have his image and his likeness stamped upon us. Have you understood the value, worth, and dignity and responsibility that you have because of God's image in you? It's your responsibility both in how you give back all of it to him, but it's also your responsibility in how you relate to other human beings. Because if you're truly following what God says, you're not going to be able to talk bad about that friend of yours behind their back. You're not going to be able to make that comment on social media. You're not going to be able to lie about someone to make yourself look better. You're not going to be able to exploit someone for your benefit, even if it's legal to do so. Why? because you realize they are a human being created in God's image, and to do such an act against them is not just an attack on them, but it's an attack on the God who made them and imprinted them with his image. How are you acting like his specially created image bearers? One of the reasons that Jesus came and died on the cross and rose from the grave was to, of course, to provide salvation. But part of that salvation, the outcome of that salvation, is so that we can have the relationship with God we were intended to have before we rebelled against him. And also so that image of God, which has been marred, it hasn't been destroyed, but it's been marred, it's been torn because of sin, that it can be begun to be restored through his living inside of us and making us gradually what we were intended to be, in his image, in his likeness, relating to him, speaking with him, having a relationship with him the way we should. So let us ask God for a better understanding and a better practice from that understanding of the image of God in us. And let us praise him that he, in his infinite wisdom, imbued us with value and dignity by giving us that image, and then he gives us responsibilities. That is a true privilege. Nothing else in this whole world has the privilege to have a relationship with the Creator that you and I have. It's exclusive to us, and it's exclusive to us to have the value and dignity that comes along with it. Let's pray. Father, may we understand more fully how wonderful it is to be created in your image. We ask your forgiveness because we often don't treat each other that way. We often don't view human beings that way. Our society, and we're a part of that, has so devalued human life because we do not value you or your image and likeness in every human being. We have gone our own way, and it's not led to good outcomes. It never does. We ask your forgiveness. For those who are joining with us who are not yet Christians, please help them to understand that they have that inherent value and dignity because they are created in your image, but that sin has messed it up significantly. And they won't understand it properly, and they won't be able to practice it correctly unless they repent of their sin and come to a saving knowledge of Jesus. Help them to do so. And for my fellow Christians, I pray that you would take the blinders off and help us to realize we have never met another human being who's just an average human being, so to speak, a mere human being. They are all of such worth and value, and each has an eternal soul that will go to only one of two places. May we follow the orders you've given us so that they can live forever with you. And we look forward and long for that day when that image will be fully restored and this world will be restored in the new heavens and the new earth, and we will be able to operate like we should. As we anticipate that, help us to live increasingly the way you have intended for us to live now, so that we're ready when you take us to be with you. We ask all of this in your name. Amen.